When you hear stories of neurodivergence, yet you can't find the ones that speak to your life. Utopia the campaign aims to platform the voices of neurodivergence across different communities and life circumstances, so we find the words to get the support we need. Join me, Samantha, Director of ADHD Girls, as I uncover hidden stories of neurodivergence that come from a few, but speak to so many parts of our lives.
Hello, Cecilia. Good morning or good evening where you are. Can you start by maybe telling me a little bit about yourself, your name, where you're from, and where you are right now?
Yeah, good evening to you from New Zealand. My name is Cecilia. My last name is Fang, so I'm Chinese. I immigrated to New Zealand, and this has been my home for a really long time. Currently, I'm a young professional working at Microsoft as a modern work specialist.
Great. Well, thank you so much for accepting this interview. And I know that we've been chatting a bit on email before this, and you mentioned that your ADHD presented at a young age, yet it was down to personality traits, right? And you were also navigating, trying to understand more about autism and OCD and other co-occurrence. Can I ask you, how has ADHD presented in your life from a young age?
Yeah, and that's such a great question, and often one I think about every day. So as I mentioned earlier, I immigrated to New Zealand at a pretty young age. I was 8 years old. And growing up, I was always a very energetic child. And I think when you grow up Asian, it's not necessarily a good thing. There's a specific view on, I think, what a good Asian woman is like, personality wise, maybe even looks wise. And I often felt like I didn't fit what that was meant to be. So growing up, I had a lot of traits that presented such as high energy, very talkative, a bit too much is the feedback, but also just very impatient. And I think these traits, now reflecting back, I realize why they existed. But I was always told they were very bad traits. But I almost grew up in very blissful ignorance, in the sense that, these were traits that I thought I could train myself out of. And, I had very little knowledge about what ADHD was. I think very few people do, which is why, I didn't realize that I needed to get diagnosed until I was an adult. So I was diagnosed last year at the age of 26. And I read this interesting book that talked about, traits of neurodiversity sometimes don't present themselves until you feel overwhelmed with life. And for me, that was obviously during the pandemic, where I was working from home a lot. I was very lonely. I wasn't seeing my friends. And the pressures of everyday life just kind of collapsed in on me. And that's when I realized that these so-called personality traits might be a little more permanent than I thought. So yeah, I guess revisiting your question in terms of being diagnosed now and learning more about, even other conditions like autism and OCD, I've almost kind of realized that there's a lot of parallels, and they're very different developmental disorders, but I think there's a lot of similarities and experiences. Social anxiety is a huge one. That sense of imposter syndrome is a huge one, and one I feel every day at work. But I think, for me, it was growing up, having that Asian background, always carrying that sense of inferiority in a sense, but also having a very lonely life as an only child, not having people to validate me and accept me, was really difficult.
No, yeah, I couldn't completely relate. I grew up obviously from similar backgrounds. I'm Malaysian Chinese, and I think in the Asian culture, especially in the old days, I don't know what it's like now. We are sort of seen and not heard, right? And you respect your elders. You do as you're told. And if you're a girl, and I suppose you're the only child, you kind of have to also help out in the family. That's quite a bit of responsibility from a young age, and you don't really get a choice in the matter. And yeah, I suppose the way Asian parents, parent their children are also quite different. And like having to kind of mask a lot of these difficulties because you see them as a fault almost, and you just like you almost expect it to be to get in line, right? Do you find that with your upbringing? And I know you mentioned also that you have a cross-cultural background, so your family migrated when you were a young age. Can you tell me a little bit about how you adjusted, and if anything changed within you when you moved to New Zealand from China?
Yeah, and so much of what you just said, Sam, I really resonate with. I think one thing is having ADHD, but in the background, what was even more difficult is, when we immigrated here, we took everything we had. My parents sold everything in hopes of a better life. And that's what they did. They tried to do their best to survive in an environment that was very foreign to them. And I think the challenging thing is when you're a child, in the beginning, it's quite easy. You're exposed to a new environment. It's all very exciting. You're learning a new language. You're meeting new friends. But as you grow older, as you go into adolescence, trying to balance those two identities is incredibly difficult. Because for me, and I've lived everywhere, I've been to over 12 schools in my lifetime. So there was a lot of movement in my life. There was no kind of permanence. And I was constantly in new environments. And I think in Western society, it's almost kind of praised that you be authentic, you be true to yourself, down to earth, very extroverted. And I know at least in Australia and New Zealand, it's kind of the culture. But in Asia, you're kind of expected to, bury the bad things and kind of keep quiet and keep your head down and just be humble. And so even reconciling those two kind of cultural identities was very difficult. So for me, naturally having these traits that were very opposite to Asian culture, it was already very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, completely. And did you find like perhaps, throughout your school life, and like whilst you were flying under the radar, there was a reason why they didn't see you, they didn't see your neurodivergence, for maybe because, being a female with ADHD, with, potentially other co-occurrences and cross-cultural perspective as well. I think you mentioned about how Asian children are expected to just like do as they're told and not stand out too much. Whereas in the Western culture, it's about really owning it, being different and, fulfilling your potential. And I came across, the Maslow hierarchy of needs, which apparently is not the same within the Asian culture, where what we prize and value is so different. And I think that also impacts how, the choices we make in our lives and where we go. And so I was wondering, as you were growing up, with your family and also in school, did you think that maybe there was a reason why they did not see your ADHD?
Yeah. You've touched on some really good points there, I think. If I start by thinking about just Chinese culture, or even maybe I could even broaden that to East Asian culture, right? Mental health, neurodiversity, they're not topics that were ever taught in school or even had in general society. And I think when I think about the way that I grew up, being an only child, not having siblings, and the only people there with me as I moved and shifted were my parents, right? So I think, growing up, they weren't equipped to kind of see the traits that correlated with ADHD symptoms. So they didn't know better. And I think my parents had one goal in mind when they moved to New Zealand. It was to survive. Like their life wasn't founded on, let's give her needs beyond material needs. For them, it was putting food on the table, trying to find the next job. And that's why we moved so much. My dad, he had to learn a new language. He was an engineer back in China. So it was very difficult for him to learn the jargon. And it took many, many terrible and underpaid jobs for him to, eventually get there. So I think as a child, seeing that is very difficult, right? Like you see the struggle that your parents go through and you feel that guilt and, what emotional needs, you can't really ask for anything more than what you already have. So I think in terms of why it flew under the radar, I don't really have many people to blame because I know my parents did the best. But at the same time, if I think about even teachers, and I apply the same thinking, they're not well educated to kind of diagnose me or even see those signs. And I think about myself and I think I couldn't diagnose myself until last year. So that's 26 years that I didn't see those traits. And I think most people have such a little amount of knowledge around neurodivergence and what that means. And even myself these days, I still have a lot of stigma in terms of what I think autism or OCD or dyslexia looks like. And we have a way of painting these neurodivergent traits to be a very specific way. And that's something that needs to change.
Completely, and I think that's the whole reason why this campaign came to be, and like I was really, looking around and seeing that although, there are some internal thought patterns that I could relate with, people who say they have ADHD in the mainstream media. There was just general things within our culture and our ethnicity and the way we've been raised that I just didn't really see, that was the same. And like, so you mentioned that, well, obviously you have no one to blame, but like, say, the teachers in the 90s, I suppose they didn't really know much about ADHD apart from it being a naughty white boy syndrome. And that's all I talk about within like all my talks is that, there is this gender bias in diagnosis because the pre-assessment rating scales that you use for ADHD, right, to see if you fulfill the criteria to be referred to a specialist is done based on research, with white boys and young white boys as well, not even adults. So that there is also the ethnicity bias, the cultural bias, and the, the sexual orientation bias for the LGBTQ community. And so, like, I would like to ask you, having been raised as an immigrant, have you ever reached out for help, in school, or were you like, you just use your intelligence to sort of fly through school? Like, if you can turn back time, what would you tell your teachers that young Cecilia need?
Yeah, it's really interesting thinking back to when I was younger because, as I mentioned before, I grew up, pretty freely in a complete kind of sense of ignorance. I think what was really difficult for me was, on one hand, it was very clear what I had to do to be successful in school. The metrics are there. You get good grades, you do well. And then once you graduate, it's about maybe it's your salary or what position you do or certain professions even. And I think the view on that from the Asian perspective is so clear. Financial success means happiness in Asian culture. Getting that job security is all you should be really aiming for. So for me, it was, difficult fitting into like an institution or formal education or into the workplace. On one hand, because I feel like I could never be myself. But on the other hand, it was very clear what the objective was. I think the difficult thing is, if I could turn back time and ask my teachers for help, I don't think they'd be equipped to help me. I think so many people are not well educated enough about neurodiversity. And so it took me so long to spot the signs in myself. And I just don't think educators or even sometimes healthcare professionals are well educated enough because every neurodiversity story is so incredibly different. So that raises the importance of things like culturally appropriate and gender appropriate healthcare. But obviously, like, if I think back to it, do I kind of regret not getting diagnosed earlier? Yes, because on one hand, I recognize that, maybe there could have been behavioral therapy or I could have gotten a coach to help me kind of adjust to my ADHD. But on the other hand, maybe even, I could have gone on medication and adjusted to that. But unfortunately, my family were just not well educated enough about neurodiversity, and we didn't have the resources to do that. So it's something I've had to navigate as an adult. That being said, I've been very fortunate to work in a place that has shown me immense amount of empathy. And now I have the resources to get that for myself, even though it was a little inaccessible, which I'll touch on later. But for me, I always try and look at the silver lining. I work with people that have ADHD that are incredibly intelligent, incredibly creative. And that's one of the many perks, like the silver lining I look at is, although I have these traits that might make me look undesirable in my culture or in my family or even in friendships, I also have, something called, I'm twice exceptional, which means I'm very smart, I'm very high energy, and I vibe really well with other people with ADHD. So I think looking back, I wish I had the resources to kind of understand myself and forgive myself earlier. But that being said, as an adult, realizing this and still getting that kind of self forgiveness, I'm just glad it kind of happened.
Yeah, and actually, like you said, even if you were diagnosed earlier, you weren't sure if the culture or the society at the time had the knowledge to really help you, because the stigma was so prevalent. And I know for a fact, after speaking to so many people from various diverse backgrounds, in certain cultures and ethnicity, where it could be a hindrance to be diagnosed with such a stigmatizing condition, and it literally changes their entire lives.
Yeah.
And that can really, be detrimental for a young child to very early on, have a stamp on their, shoulder to say that, I'm really different because I'm this. And then therefore people expect them to be, and then maybe they will just be, right? Because we don't have a chance to be otherwise. But it was, in some ways, now is such a good time to be diagnosed with neurodivergence, because people are catching up now, people are curious, and if we, you and I were diagnosed earlier on, who knows what would happen, right? Especially in an Asian culture where they pretty much see, neurodivergence, in the same category as mental health, difficulties. And so, I think that's pros and cons to things. And definitely being diagnosed later in life comes with some mental health challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam, I think I'd love to kind of share a story, right? I remember when I was an intermediate, and during this time, of course, again, I was just being a kid. I was 11 or 12 years old, and there was a kid in my class that was a little weird, and everyone found him really weird. And we didn't know why he was weird, but as kids do, you kind of bully him and you call him weird, and you single him out. And I remember one day, his mom came into the classroom and our teacher sat us all down, and she said, "Hey, Jonah has autism, and this means that he can't interact socially well, he can't read cues as well, but we ask that you be kind to him." And to be fair, like I didn't know what that meant, but I think back now, and I think even though teachers won't always be educated on what neurodiversity looks like, you can still create an environment for empathy and understanding, and that's something that I think one thing I would have been very grateful for is, instead of being told about all of these negative traits that you have, maybe focusing more on praise and positive feedback, because even getting, diagnosed as an adult was an incredibly jarring experience, sitting there with a list of things that said, bad in social situations, excessive talking, too much energy, distracted, blah, blah, blah. These are not nice things you want to hear about yourself. So yeah, just showing up with empathy and giving it to others freely, I think, is the only thing that we can really ask for if they don't understand us completely.
No, yeah, completely positive framing, right? And that's like all about, really giving like positivity and, helping your child feel, boosted with their self-esteem and just have some confidence in themselves. I think there was a research out there that says by the time like a child with ADHD is at the age of 12, they would have heard at least 20,000 negative messages about themselves. And can you imagine what that can do to their self-esteem? And also, what that can do when you add like this cultural bias to it, where we tend to work even harder in order to prove to others that we're not as bad as, so some people say, well, you're just trying to create this facade of perfectionism and everything's okay with me because I'm so at peace on the surface, right? But underneath that iceberg, there's always some mental health challenges.
Yeah.
And I know you talked about the workplace as well just now, about how, you know, you could like access help or support at work. And one of the things I want to touch on is that ADHD or other neurodivergence, you know, can manifest differently for people from cultures that are not like, you know, in the general majority. And so it often comes out in somatic physical symptoms, right? And I've heard this from a psychiatrist before as well, you know, where he said like instead of anxiety or depression, which is strangely a very new vocabulary to me. And so instead of that, you know, people are experiencing stomach aches, you know, they're coming to them with stomach aches and chest pains, and, you know, whereas kind of like upper body pains, you know, and so I'm interested to find out from you, you know, say if you're in this environment, it's fast paced, you know, expected to do maybe more than like you would normally be chilled enough to do, you know, what tends to happen? Like how does, you know, stress shows up in your body?
Yeah. One thing that I think I've always struggled with, to touch on the mental health point, is anxiety. So earlier, I think I spoke about, you know, growing up in a pretty traditional Chinese household. So humility was at the heart of what my family wanted to be. And I grew up feeling a strong sense of I need to be humble, I need to be continuously learning and growing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's made me very ambitious, but at the same time, it's created a lot of insecurity and never feeling, I guess, adequate or good enough. And that's really difficult, right? Because also naturally, I'm a very anxious person. And, you know, my psychiatrist said to me, a lot of people with ADHD, I think the stat is like something like 30 to 40% have anxiety, because our mind is so fast. We always have so many thoughts racing, and it's very easy for us to get, you know, caught in something mentally. Um, Actually, the first sign that I had pretty bad anxiety was I had a panic attack, and I had no idea what that was. I thought I had asthma. And then my friend was the one that told me, no, that's definitely a panic attack. And I remember I had quite a few of these, and over time, you know, other traits started presenting itself. And then, like I mentioned earlier, during the pandemic, that's when I got diagnosed. But anxiety and ADHD are very hand in hand, and that was one of the things that kind of made life really difficult for me, because I don't know about you, but there are some days where I feel really down on myself. There are some days where I take my medication, I'm super productive and focused, and I can show up in a very fast paced work environment as the brilliant person that I am, and I'm very smart, I'm on top of it, and I'm very sociable. But there are days that I don't take my medication because anxiety is one of those side effects, so it exacerbates what I already have. And so days I don't take my medication, or days where you know, I let my ADHD run free, I get really hard on myself, because some of those, you know, those traits that were labeled as negative, they come back to haunt me. And I kick myself when I'm down. I think, how could you be so distracted? How have you been so unproductive today? You were so annoying and no one likes you, and blah, 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 right? The other way that I think has been quite challenging is obviously, you know, I work for a company that is very fast paced and high pressure. And in the tech industry, things are constantly changing. And one metaphor I always use is that the tech industry has pretty bad ADHD. Like, it is constantly moving, it keeps giving you new information, it's always changing. And I just think in that kind of environment, right, it's very easy to lose yourself and feel overwhelmed. And when you already have something, not even just ADHD, but things like OCD, or autism, you know, sometimes situations present itself in the workplace that make life very difficult. So in times of stress, I find that, you know, I even get like body aches, you know, because I tense my body so much more because I'm trying to make myself focus, or headaches. And I have an idea of mental health being a very holistic thing, right? Physical health links to your emotional health, and that links to your family's health, and that links to your social health, and everything is connected. And I think the pandemic was a really great illustration of that is, some people were at home taking care of their family, so their mental health fell apart. People weren't exercising, so their mental health fell apart. People with neurodivergence had an even harder time because we already had so many struggles. So having these extra things on top to overwhelm us made it even more challenging. So yeah.
What would help you in your workplace? Because obviously, we're trying to do our best jobs, right? And I think it sounds as if you put in, even more effort to try and do that good job, all the time, consistently. But as you know, we are human beings, and even without neurodivergence, we are prone to, some days are not great, right? Some days are better if you don't sleep well, if you don't eat enough. And what would help you to actually feel you can turn to somebody for help in the workplace?
Yeah.
Would it be maybe having this culture where people feel safe to open up, or anything else that you can really talk about?
Yeah, it's really funny that you asked that, because when I shared my story, and usually in the workplace, I'm actually quite reserved. I don't share a lot of details about my private life. And I've been at Microsoft for 3 years now, and this all these struggles that I've shared today were not things I felt comfortable sharing with colleagues. And the reason why I shared my story in the last 6 months was because, one, I got diagnosed. I had a greater sense of clarity of who I was, and what I needed. But I had a manager change. So I started a new position, and the manager basically joined the same time that I did. And this manager was so incredibly empathetic and caring and genuine that he was one of the first people I told about my diagnosis, and because I was going on medication as well. And I felt that I needed to tell someone at work in case, I did start to struggle and show signs of overwhelm. And I remember I had this conversation, and when I got diagnosed, I told quite a few people in my life, right? Because you want to share that part of yourself and be vulnerable. And even friends of mine challenged me. They said, your grades at school were so good. You did law school fine. So, I'm sure it's nothing. You're probably just overthinking it. And when I told my manager, I said, hey, I have ADHD, and there are some days that I sit there and the executive functioning is not happening, and I feel unproductive, and I like tasks drop out of my to-do list because I forget, and I feel really guilty all the time. And he said to me, he was like, Cecilia, I really don't know anything about ADHD, but I would love to learn. So please
Wow.
teach me more. And that was one of the kindest things that people have said to me since I got diagnosed. And since then, I've kind of kept him updated in terms of, hey, I'm going on this new medication. There might be some side effects. There might be days where I'm not performing at my best. And now that I've shared my story, I've had colleagues ask me, how do you prefer to work? And for me, it's things like, hey, I don't mind if you send me a gentle reminder about something I've forgotten. I'm sorry if I come to your desk and I distract you for half an hour talking about your weekend. I'm just really excited to see you. It's those little things, right? And I think we're not necessarily having to have everyone understand us. But I think, in the same way that I would have loved other people in my school to show more empathy, it's also really important in the workplace, having people be more aware of this is what neurodivergence actually looks like and how it manifests itself, but also how can we be more kind to our colleagues? How can we show that same kindness we did in the pandemic when you had a crying baby in the background or a dog barking in the background? And yeah, it's all the same kind of level of showing understanding and empathy, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think the points you touched on are so important about the manager, and I suppose the professional relationships you have in work. It kind of makes or breaks, our time at work. And I love what your manager said. That is exactly what I tell people. Really, it doesn't take much to actually be an active listener without making your own preconceived notions, form that conversation. So, what he said about he doesn't know, but he would love to understand more. That's just perfect. And for you to feel safe enough to go to your manager, that just shows that, it is working. there is this feeling of safety of being your own authentic self, and that's actually amazing and actually quite rare that that's happened. And it's great that you have that story to tell, and it's allowed you to be authentic, and also tell them on days when you just really struggle, and just maybe you can even ask to work from home on those days. So some days you just don't want to talk to people. And I completely get it. And one thing I was going to say as well is that the fact that you were late diagnosed, the fact that it was during the pandemic, and the fact that there are days where you feel on top and there are days where you feel it's difficult. Do you think that it could be tied to your hormonal cycle at all? Just because there's a known correlation between estrogen and dopamine. We know that dopamine exists at an imbalance level within the ADHD brain. So, and suddenly for me, that plays a massive part.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an added struggle of being a woman, right? And not only that, and we talked about it before, the difficulties of getting diagnosed as a woman as well. And I think there's so many things that we have to think about, when we think about neurodivergence being intersectional. I don't even feel, qualified to tell someone else with ADHD, I understand where you're coming from, because there are so many identities within one person, so many things they struggle with. And I just think, one of my friends at work, she told me when she first saw a psychiatrist, because she suspected she had ADHD, and she was in her late 20s as well, and she was an Asian woman. And after she waited months, she finally saw the psychiatrist, and he basically told her, "Oh, you're overthinking this. I don't think you have that at all. I think you're just exaggerating what you have." And that to me is just incredibly silly, because you think, why would I pay that much money and wait that long if I didn't think this was really serious? And I think, there's a lot of physical challenges that we have, not only as women, but there's so many things we have to balance. Like the side effects thing of medication has been so difficult for me as someone, and of course women, and maybe it's because more women have anxiety in general, but women have more anxiety, which means a lot of medication for ADHD is not suitable for us, because it just makes that so much worse. I've had the worst time trying to find the right medication for myself, because sometimes it induces panic attacks within me. So you match that up with the hormonal cycle, and it's just a mess.
Yeah, I think I had this comment before when I was talking about the menstrual cycle for ADHDers, and it was like a dump truck putting nitroglycerin onto a landmine or something. And yeah, do you know what? I track my cycle religiously now, and believe it or not, I'm actually at the good part of the cycle now, where it's ovulation and I feel amazing and calm. And it's such a striking contrast to when it's just a week before my period and just after, where it is uncontrollable, crying and just waking up with this black cloud. I don't know what to do with myself. And I know, so frustratingly, I know for a fact that it could be so easily rectified if they had done some research on it, right? It's just so frustrating to know that you can't go to anyone for help unless you're willing to see a specialist to do various biochemical analysis on you, and still no one really has a very clear picture with healthcare. So completely with you there, and we are I think there isn't a single woman with ADHD who's not impacted by hormones. So at least we know that now. I think that helps with some understanding and hopefully shape some research. And I wanted to ask you, because you talked about healthcare professionals too, and your friend going to a psychiatrist, paying lots of money, and then pretty much got gaslit about their own conditions, right? Do you have a message out there? Because I know there are a lot of healthcare professionals who want to learn. I know for a fact that the company that I'm collaborating with, QB Tech, are really good, because they also use objective measurements of ADHD, and their clinicians are very on the case with how ADHD can present, in different minority groups and different communities. So do you have a message for healthcare professionals about how to diagnose and maybe support neurodivergent women who come from circumstances similar to yours?
Yeah, I think firstly, right, accessibility is an ongoing issue. I'm not sure about the UK, but in New Zealand, I called up, I think, over 20 psychologists and psychiatrists. Most of them, were booked out a year in advance. And I had to wait about 5 months, which was a pretty short wait to get, diagnosed. But that was a pretty painful process. And it's also very, very expensive. And I think a lot of people with lower incomes, they won't even have the knowledge, let alone they won't even have the money to kind of go get diagnosed. So I think on top of that, once you do have the knowledge and once you do have the resources to actually get diagnosed and adequate healthcare to get the medication that you need to find a psychiatrist that really understands you. The last thing you want to hear after waiting for that long and paying that much money is oh, you're wrong. You need to just change your mindset. You're being dramatic or whatever else. And I think the way that ADHD presents itself in someone like an Asian woman or even like, just a white man are very different. It is incredibly different. Every person's experience. And I think on one hand, I've kind of shared today about my challenges as an Asian woman with ADHD, but I've also had, colleagues of mine who were white men who got diagnosed later in life in their 40s. And they've said to me, I'm afraid to tell my friends. I don't want to tell my family. I find it like incredibly shameful. And that's an issue in itself, right? I've told like everyone that wants to listen on the street now because I think it's something that I really want to embrace and be authentic about. But
Yes.
these are all very different issues that different groups have. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the way that I present maybe in front of a healthcare professional or a colleague or a friend or as a family member is people are very quick to think, you're so chatty, you're so gossipy, you talk way too much, you need to chill out, you're way too much as a woman. And then on a guy, they might say something like, oh, you're so charismatic and outgoing and you're so sociable and funny. And that is a difference that kind of sits uncomfortably with me. And that is, a clear gender difference. So I think my message, if I could give one to healthcare professionals is just trying to understand, the story behind the disorder. And I think that really helps you to understand where they struggle, but also how their symptoms present, just so you can show up better with more empathy and kindness.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, no, just look at the individual as an individual, maybe don't look at the textbooks. And because the lived experience, is so diverse and so varied. So, really appreciate that. And now I want to ask you the final question, which is really a story of culture. Because the more I look into neurodivergence, the more I see the inequalities are due to the way our society has been shaped and, the unspoken biases and prejudices, as well as some of the doors that are open to you and like me and others. How did your beginnings, as an immigrant, very clever. You come from actually what would be a middle class or maybe an upper class background in China, and you came to New Zealand and you had to start over again. Your parents, put food on the table, and you had what you needed to concentrate at school, to get the good grades that you're talking about and get a good job. Has it like shaped your perception of yourself and your place in society? Including the effort you put into education as a tool for social mobility, and then going on into your career right now.
Yeah, I think, education and humility and I guess humbleness is very core to Asian culture, especially Chinese culture. You need to have financial success. You need to have job security. You need to get good grades because that's what makes your family proud of you, and that's what makes you successful in life and apparently happy in life. And I think that was a very misguided thing that I had to actively unlearn as I became an adult, because it felt like I was always chasing the next achievement or the next goal, and that's not a healthy habit to have. And I think it created a strong sense of imposter syndrome within me because, the nature of comparison is that you're never going to win. You always find someone better than you in some shape or form, and you compare. So you can tell yourself that you're inferior to this person in some way. And I think that's a habit that I've built from my culture that I really dislike. And I think in a negative way, that's how it's shaped me. But in a positive way, yes, it's made me very ambitious. It's made me very high achieving. It's made me, want to do better and learn more. But I think, has it been the right way to go? Probably not. And I think a lot of other Asian immigrants can probably resonate with that. It's not always about getting the best grades. It's not always about getting the best job. After the pandemic, we now see so many people resigning their jobs to go travel, or just to be happy in their own way. And I think that's indicative of the way that society is moving, the new generation that's coming in, right? And I think that's wonderful that we can chase our own forms of happiness. So I think Asian culture is a difficult one because it can be very prescriptive. And often we feel like we have to fit a very specific mold. And for me, that's been very hard to break out of. So I think now in my late 20s, I'm still figuring things out. I'm still figuring out how to, be my authentic self while having these apparent negative traits of ADHD. But just accepting myself for that and trying to break out of Western culture and Eastern culture to be the best version of myself.
Yeah, well, that's really heartwarming and touching to hear, because you talk about your own journey, but also like the journey that society is going through. It feels like we're all going through some sort of growth here, because the whole world's been, shocked into thinking about a new way of doing things and a new way of going, and, our own journey of diagnosis later in life, figuring out what to do in the next year or 2 years and beyond in our lives. It feels like we're all going through a process that will hopefully somewhere along the line settle into more kind of certainty, right? And I love talking to you, Cecilia. You're so articulate. I love your honesty, your candor, and everything that you're given to this episode. And thank you so much for joining me and being so patient throughout this whole process. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Sam, for reaching out to me. I think what you're doing here is so inspiring, right? Like, through my journey of sharing my story, I've connected with so many people within Microsoft, but also in my personal life, and just with strangers that have had very similar or very different journeys. And I think that's why conversations like this are so important. And I honestly can't wait to see what kind of stories you pump out, because it's going to be very, very good for learning for people in the neurodiversity community, but also beyond.
What did you think of this episode? If it resonates with you, do share it so we can empower other neurodivergents too. We want to open up conversations for neurodivergents across all communities, especially the ones who are underrepresented, so they can get diagnosed and find the support they need in life and work. I'm Samantha, Director of ADHD Girls, and you can invite me to speak at your organization or subscribe to my upcoming bite-sized video courses on ADHD and neurodiversity via a new learning platform called Utopia. You can find a link via my link tree within my bio on Instagram and LinkedIn. Special thanks to QBTech for being such a wonderful collaborator throughout phase 1 of this campaign.